Okay, so let's talk French Rev. Our hats are off. There we go. The French government's got some problems, and a couple of things. Those problems are going to come together and are going to set up the French Revolution. We want to look at how the French government reacted to that and the different forms of the French government where that took place. Great. All right. This computer is struggling. Okay, here's the main idea. The French Revolution began when long-term and short-term problems combined with Enlightenment ideas to result in the overthrow of the French king. All right, so that's a classic way to look at the French Revolution, is to explain that by the end of it, it's going to come back to sort of where it started before, kind of like the English Revolution in a lot of ways. It's funny, the more revolutions you study, the more you wonder if they really change much. But, I mean, they definitely changed some things. The English Revolution, at least, we know it limited the power of the English king. The French Revolution, in the end, comes back around, and yes, they get a king again, but his power is more limited than it was before. But I don't think that's what people thought was going to happen. I don't know. Anyway, though, they've overthrown their king, established a new government, and written this Declaration of the Rights of Man and of the Citizen. So how does all this start? What's this box down here? Okay, so two causes. Deep roots, something that was long-term, and something that was more immediate. Okay, so you have the three estates in there. We saw that in the video. The three estates were the sections of society that got represented in the Estates General. So the Estates General was like the French Parliament, but it had even less power than the English Parliament had. They were basically there to advise the king and help him sort of run the country. Now, the estates were broken up by social classes. So you had the nobles, which were, you know, the family of the king and the different people of nobility. You had the clergy, which the French nation was entirely Catholic at that point. And you have everybody else. And that's going to be the three estates. We'll come back to that. The immediate causes were within the French economy. So you have huge amounts of debt, like he said in the video. The 50% of what the government took in every year in terms of taxes, 50% of it was spent to pay the interest on the country's debts. Not paying down the debts, but paying the interest on the debts. Half of the country's money. So if you're ever worried about debt, not to say that, you know, it shouldn't be today by comparison, but the French government was in lots of debt. Huge amounts of debt. Okay, so here are the three estates. The first estate was the clergy, about 130,000 people. The second estate was the nobles, about 350,000 people. And the third estate included everybody else, about 75, who's that for? Okay, about 75 to 80% of the population. This included not just, and this is the important part, not just farmers and peasants and maybe poor factory workers, but it also included people in what we would call a middle class, people that had some extra money to spend on things like entertainment and education, and they had leisure time. So you have within that third estate a group of people who feel like that they should have more of a role in society, and they don't, because they're educated and they have money. They don't have any power, really. They're right down there with the very poorest of society in that group. And that's going to be a problem. The first estate, that's the clergy, owns about 10% of the land. So there was land that was part of the clergy's land, part of the church's land. They didn't have to pay the tax, the tithe it was called, France's main tax. They had different privileges. Their payment was often fixed to, you know, tithes. Tithes are what what people give to the church. It's 10% of their income to support the church. So this was basically owed to them by the French people. This wasn't, you didn't get to like, not that you could not go to church, but the tithe was not really optional for you. You didn't get to decide if you wanted to give money to your church. The second estate owns about 25% of the land. They don't pay the tithe either. There's tithe and then there's tithe, by the way. They also have a lot of privileges. They're the nobility. So the third estate owns about 65% of the land, but many of them have no land at all, and it's not in proportion to the actual number of people. So some other inequalities. If you remember the third estate and you wanted to, for instance, grind up your flour at a local mill, typically a noble owned it, you had to pay a fee. You wanted to use ovens to bake your bread, got to pay a fee. You wanted to use the wine presses to press your wine, got to pay a fee. And you have to pay the clergy. So the third estate, you've got people in there who have some amount of wealth, who have some education, and feel like they're being treated really as third-class citizens. And that's what we're called the bourgeoisie, the middle class. So these are people with some education, a good amount of education, could read, and were often reading Enlightenment ideas and Enlightenment books in salons. They would get together and discuss these things, not like hair salons, but salon, which is French for it's a room. It's a sitting room, and you sit around, and they would talk about these Enlightenment ideas. So when they see like naturally guaranteed rights and things like that, they're going to start to want those things and start to try to find a way to get them. Okay, financial problems. 1787 and 88, you get two bad harvests because of hail. There's a slowdown in manufacturing. About possibly a third of the population was living in poverty. When we say things like a third of the population or 80%, you have to understand that back then, this could be difficult to tell. It could be hard to be exact with this because often, people aren't conducting surveys back then to find out, how many people are poor. They might be, but it's not like today where you have all sorts of information. So a lot of times historians have to make guesses. The French government spent huge amounts on foreign wars. The war, the American War of Independence against Great Britain, went into huge amounts of debt for that. So the French government's still spending like it's not crazily in debt and not in difficult times. Now, probably, before I move on from that one, probably the most visible thing to the French people would be how the king and the nobles were living, is that through these difficult economic times, when the average French peasant or factory worker is close to starving, that there are many people who are living quite richly, and really those nobles can live richly and then not have to pay taxes on top of it. Okay, so the Estates General. This is basically the French Parliament, but hadn't been called in over 150 years. So Louis got this problem with the debt. He's got some bad harvests, and he calls them in to try to raise new taxes to pay down the debt. So you have representatives from all the estates. The first and second estates got about 300 each. The third estate had about 600. It's out of proportion. Kurt, you okay? All right, let me know if you need something. This still wasn't in proportion. Also, the way that the estates voted was that when they would vote on something for the king, each estate would get one vote for the entire estate. So the first and second estates, who often were the two that didn't have to pay taxes and so on, could outvote the third. The third estate wanted to end tax exemptions. But it's not going to happen because the other two are not going to vote to start paying taxes if they can help it. Then they said, well, look, what we could do is, to make this a little more fair and try to reform this, is everybody gets a vote. So for every delegate, there's 1,200 of them basically, every delegate gets a vote. And that way, it's a little more fair. The third estate has 600 votes. The other two estates have 300 each. Louis doesn't go for this either. So the third estate decides it's going to break off. They think they have the power to just completely break away from this and totally change the government. And that's what they do. That's when Louis locks them out of the meeting place. They say, whatever, we're going to go meet in our own place. we're going to draft a constitution, and they believe they have the support of the people in this case, and they kind of do. Okay, so what is this thing? Okay, I guess that's going to stay there. Okay, so they get locked out of the meeting place. They end up in this indoor tennis court. And they vow that they're not going to leave. And they don't mean like they're not even going to go to the bathroom or anything. But they are not going to close their large meeting until they draft a constitution for France. So Louis actually prepares to use force to try to end this. He brings soldiers into Paris. He did this to try to put down some of the riots, but what happens is the Third Estate, now called the National Assembly, sees this as him bringing in the army to try to get rid of them. The problem is that the National Army isn't backing Louis now. And you get the storming of the Bastille, which is done by the French, by Parisians. They go in, they do this to basically steal the weapons, and the army doesn't do anything to stop it. They should have, but now Louis knows that he can't trust the National Army. They're not supporting him, and there's rebellions and panic spreading all throughout the nation. So it's getting a little crazy. Man, I wish I could read that. This is a picture of the tennis court oath. We've seen that. This is the storming of the Bastille. They said it was, to get the prisoners out, and like he said in the video, there were only 7 prisoners, so it was really more about getting weapons. Okay, so you get the National Assembly, and you actually have started a couple of the clergy, a couple nobles have trickled over and said, hey, we'll come and join your new meeting. Let's give this a shot. So this National Assembly at first is sort of moderate in what they want to change. They haven't yet started talking about getting rid of the king, and they definitely haven't talked about killing him, not openly anyway. But they say, hey, we'll end some of the privileges for the clergy and the nobles. We'll make it so that it isn't so unequal. That's their plan. They draft the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen, inspired by the Declaration of Independence, protects the rights of liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. But it outlaws and it says that everybody has these rights, basically. The United States Constitution didn't apply to people outside the United States. Maybe people would have thought, yeah, other people should have rights and stuff like that. But the French one really applies in a way to people outside of France as well. They feel. Some of them feel. We'll come back. What's in there that's Enlightenment ideals? So freedom and equal rights for all men. Women, no, not yet. Still not managing to accomplish that. Access to public office, meaning the ability to be part of the government, to have one of those positions, to govern the country, should be based on talent and not your birth, not your nobility. There would be no exemptions to taxation. Everyone was subject to taxes. All citizens could take part in making laws, not just the king. And freedom of speech and the press should be protected. They put that in as well. All right, everything's going okay. Louis actually thinks this might not be too bad, but in the end, he does refuse to accept the Declaration and any of these changes. He probably shouldn't have. Who knows what it might have been totally different had he said, yeah, okay. But he doesn't do this because he's the king, and he's afraid that this will be bad if he gives up this much power. This is the famous the Bread March, or the Women's March, Parisian women, on the rumor that Marie Antoinette was hoarding grain in the palace at Versailles. The Parisian women marched there. This is one picture of it. I don't know if they got a cannon, but if they got a cannon, it was definitely bad news. Not sure if they would have known how to operate it, but well, maybe they didn't even need to operate it to tell them, listen, let's have a little chat. Anyway, the idea is they weren't ready to kill him yet, but Versailles sits outside of Paris. Remember, they built this so that it could, not just to try to bring the nobles in, but it's much nicer outside the city. The air is a lot cleaner. There's less human waste flowing in the streets. So you have this, you're the king. It's good to be the king. You go out into Versailles. So the National Assembly is meeting in Paris. So the idea is take Louis and Marie and you take them back to Paris, and they're going to be there to show their support for the National Assembly, to show that they're supporting these changes. What else? They're not abolishing the church yet. It's going to be run by the government, and instead of the clergy being appointed by, by the king, they would be elected by the people. The National Assembly writes a new constitution that includes a king, but he's not going to make the laws. Okay, so Louis doesn't like how this is going, and he thinks things are turning bad, so he's going to try to escape Paris. They dress up in some strange clothes to try to disguise their identity. The story goes was that someone was able to identify him by having recognized his face from being on all the coins, basically. So he tries to get out, but he's eventually recaptured by the National Assembly and brought back. All right, so we're going to pick that up tomorrow and start talking about why we actually get to Louis getting killed and where the revolution starts to get a little crazy. How many smart questions are there? 5? All right, take 4 minutes.